koutou katoa. I'm just going to welcome everybody as the liaison for Liviana for this session. And just for those of you, I think everybody here knows, but I will say for anybody who doesn't, that this session is taking place as part of the Liviana conference, which is hosted by the Community Economies Institute for all members of the Community Economies Research Network and other interested people. The Community Economies Research Network's an international network of researchers, activists, artists, practitioners, and others who are all interested in ways of enacting new visions and new practices of economy. And I'm really excited to be here today to hear from two fantastic members of that network, Maria and Kelly. I've got some information behind me about how the session runs, rather than putting the slide up, but just so people know that it's being recorded and that the recording goes onto the YouTube of CERN. And just sort of some housekeeping around keeping your microphone muted while other people are talking. And feel free to put anything into the chat if you've got a question or a comment as we go along. Over to you, Kelly and Maria.
Oh, Maria's going to start us with a karakia or blessing.
Tēnā koutou katoa. He karakia tēnei mō tēnei rā, mō tēnei wā hoki ki Aotearoa. Me karakia tātou, toi tū te whenua, toi tū te tiriti o Waitangi, me tū ā-uru, haumie, huie, tākie.
Kia ora. Tēnā tātou, kua tai mai hui mai nei, tēnā koe Maria, tēnā koutou katoa. I'm Kelly Dombrowski. I'm a member of the Community Economies Institute. I think I know all of you here, so I'm not going to have to introduce myself much, which is great. What I'm really excited about this session is to bring Maria in to talk about her many years of work in diverse and community economies, influenced and adjacent. Maria is a professor in Māori studies here at Te Herenga Waka. Her research spans a wide range of topics, including Māori political representation, constitutional change, environmental politics, and political economy. And her work's focused on the intersections of Māori political economy and resource management, including hidden and diverse economies. Maria has lots of other governance roles, and she served on the Matike Mai Aotearoa working group for constitutional reform, and she has been appointed as the Deputy Chair of the Independent Review of Electoral Law. But what I really wanted to bring into the room today was Maria and her colleagues recently completed a project that developed an approach to sharing authority between Indigenous and settler systems for environmental management. And this report's called Me Tū ā-uru, an action plan for a flourishing and abundant environment. And I was fortunate enough to go to the launch of that report, and I've been following you guys on LinkedIn with all of the cool case studies coming out from that. And what really struck me was it's a really great example of what in community economies language we might call using a set of ethical coordinates to organise a huge range of successful case studies of where sharing authority has worked and where environmental care and management has been successful. And you've talked about them as a set of PO or kind of wayfinders to organise around. So what we thought we would do in this session is I prepared a set of questions to kind of ask Maria just to give her some space to tell us a bit more about this report that she's done with her colleagues. And those of you that don't know, it's particularly significant at this time because our government in Aotearoa New Zealand has, you know, caved into a very small minority of people and let a treaty principles bill go to reading, which undermines, as you just said, 40 years of jurisprudence around Te Tiriti o Waitangi, our founding document in Aotearoa New Zealand. And there's a hikoi, a protest march at the moment coming down from the far north of New Zealand which will arrive in Wellington next week. And there's just been a lot of gathering and protest around this, but there's also opened up a lot of, you know, division and space for people to say stupid, bad stuff. And so I felt like when we organised this, that we didn't really have that in mind, but now it's the day that it's going in there. So I feel like this session's even more important than when we first thought of it. So, yeah, Maria, do you want to tell us a bit about your background and how you came to connect both with the kaupapa of diverse economies and the idea of sharing authority? Yeah.
Well, tēnā koe, Kelly. Tēnā tātou anō, ngā mihi kia koutou. Yeah, so how I came to it, well, I was in Canberra doing my PhD and under the guidance of Barry Hindis and getting near to the end, and Julie Graham and Catherine Gibson had done some presentations at ANU, and I went along and thought, oh no, this is very inspiring, and I'm right at the end of my PhD and thought, I can't do anything now. I'm too close to the end. It's too late but I wanted to immediately kind of dig into the diverse economies, and what they were talking about made so much sense, and suddenly to me was kind of a more inspiring way of conducting the things that I'd been trying to say. So I'd written a whole PhD about neoliberalism, free trade agreements, and the end of capitalism as we knew it, you know, just sort of, I, you know, read that for the first time, and it was, I just thought, oh no, you know, blew my mind really. So thank you for that, Catherine. And actually the other Catherine McKinnon was around at ANU at that same sort of time. And yeah, but as I said, it was too late. So I had to just finish my PhD, and maybe Matt resonates in some ways. Kelly was filling me in on your discussion the other day about your book. You know, at the end, you can see a slightly different sort of intellectual path that you want to go on, but you've got to kind of finish that project before moving on. So so I wrote this whole PhD about neoliberalism and free trade agreements in the Pacific. There was some aspects about Indigenous resistance. So I was trying to, you know, before being introduced to the diverse economies thing, I was sort of, you know, fumbling around in the darkness, really trying to look at, in that case, I was using resistance, Indigenous resistance as a way to try to focus on the things that were already taking us to where we might want to get to. But the diverse economies framework certainly shifted and I think created a framework which could more easily facilitate looking at those things, the kind of you know, potentially positive futures. And that's, we were talking earlier, I've gone back and read some of my older work, which you know, you often don't tend to, well, I don't tend to do in case it's terrible, but it wasn't too bad. The things around the ethical coordinates, where I tried to use those and mull through how do they, you know, fit in the context of Aotearoa, in the context of a kind of Māori worldview. And they, of course, didn't quite fit, but I was trying to cobble things together. And I think with our action plan and things, funnily enough, it's still that kind of cobbling together that I've been trying to do, of where are these tentative steps that are being taken, and if, you know, how can we support and strengthen them?
So it seems like the approach that you've taken is to identify sets of shared values that Māori have, but also that connect with wider New Zealand society.
Yeah, well, they're within tikanga Māori, they're within a kind of Māori legal tradition, if you like, but it's not just a legal tradition. There are these sort of key values or and also practices that tend to be prioritised and kind of considered as at the heart of things, whether it's sort of political governance structures or economies, it tends to be similar. So whanaungatanga, or I saw that I called it whakapapa, but I think I was getting at the same thing. The idea of those relationships between, so literally kin relationships between people who are related, but then also the kin-like relationships with other people and peoples, and then the non-human world as well. So that whanaungatanga concept is that kind of relational web of connections with, other things, other beings, and that's sort of at the heart of it. But then, and you have mana, the kind of ideas of authority and rangatiratanga. Utu is the key other aspect about reciprocity, or we call it balance, but I've had a whole lot of scientists say, well, nothing in the natural world is balanced. So it's not, I don't mean, exactly balanced. It's more like,
cyclical.
Cyclical. You take lemons from the lemon tree and you put some seaweed fertilizer on it. It's that sort of balancing. For anything that you take something away, you have to give something back, and it might not be immediately give it back. It might be sometime later, that idea. But as Hirani Mokomead says, all gifts have to be reciprocated. So good gifts and bad gifts have to be reciprocated. So, that's that kind of idea of reciprocity is kind of built in there. So within that, even though we call them values or principles of a Māori legal tradition, they also have kind of baked into them assumptions about the appropriate behaviours and practices that would give rise to. So whanaungatanga, so thinking about your kin and then your kin-like relationships and so on, but you're also thinking ahead intergenerationally as well. And so if you take into account those considerations when you're making a decision, then that will shape the sorts of decisions that you make. And so funnily enough, I was looking at my tika transition toolbox, which is about thinking about a kind of just transition, but in the context of Aotearoa, considering tikanga Māori, te tiriti o Waitangi, and the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. But in there, I also had kind of questions which in some ways are reminiscent again of those ethical coordinates where I sort of originally started from, but to kind of tease out using those key aspects of tikanga Māori. How would this shape your decision if you were taking into account whanaungatanga and an intergenerational focus? Then the short-term decision of mining for lithium might then be tempered by, oh wait, what are we going to do with that toxic waste? I don't think our mokopuna are going to be that thrilled to have toxic waste on their doorstep. So that then reshapes your decision making.
So you had whakapapa o whanaungatanga,
Utu, mana rangatiratanga, in me tu ā-uru we had mātauranga, which often people are thinking of as a knowledge system, but we were also using as, thinking about as a way of seeing the world and understanding it at that kind of fundamental level, to guide things.
Looking at my notes, what else we're supposed to be talking about.
You can read it in my screens.
We were talking a little bit about the idea of sharing authority. And so I just had a question on sharing authority is a thing that comes up in the report, and sometimes it's known as co-governance, which you moved away from that, which you can tell us a bit about. So on the problem of sharing authority, can you tell us a bit more about what the context of that phrase is and how it relates to other struggles for Indigenous knowledge here in Aotearoa and overseas?
So why we started using that. So this was a project that Carwyn Jones, Ali Tapsell and some others and I were working on. Matt Scobie was also part of the broader Me Too ā-uru project. We were looking at what are the environmental governance and what are the environmental governance and policy models that have the best environmental outcomes. And here in Aotearoa, the examples we kept coming to were those where there was this co-governance between Māori, hapu, iwi, and either a local government or other community groups or a central government agency. And so we'd been talking about this as co-governance. But then we had Jess Berenston Shaw and her team at the workshop do some research for us about what people understood by that term and how to talk about
Pākehā,
particularly
and
Pākehā.
tau iwi or non-Indigenous.
Non-Indigenous people. And one of the biggest findings from their research on this was people didn't have a clue what you were talking about. When you said co-governance, they were, I don't know, people didn't know what that meant. What's it, how is it different from co-management? What are you even talking about? It was also then hijacked, I think you could say, in the way freedom it has been in other places by sort of right-wing groups who were opposed to Māori being part of any decision-making about natural resources and the environment in Aotearoa. And so it also then had a negative connotation for Māori and kind of put people off. So we tried to think about what was another way of talking about this. And shared authority, of course, in the international context, we can think of it again in terms of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and this idea of Indigenous peoples having long-standing ways of looking after territories and their resources, and that being reflected in that declaration, rights of self-determination and so on. So, having the right sort of people round the table to make decisions on something when they have rights and interests in it. But in our context as well with Te Tiriti, where, despite what's proposed now, at least the last 50 years of understanding some of the concepts there are around kāwanatanga, the Crown having a sphere of authority where they can make decisions. From 1840, that was meant to be just for that they would have authority over Pākehā people, or in that time the kind of British settlers that were here, and tino rangatiratanga, which was reaffirmed. Māori already had that, hapu and iwi, in 1840, and was reaffirmed for them. And so that these sort of two strands of law and politics and authority would continue side by side. Māori could govern and control lands, homes, and treasures and things, and not be pestered by the kāwanatanga sphere, and that these things will continue. So the idea of shared authority is sort of reminiscent of that as well, that there should be a partnership, and that's of course come up in a number of court cases over the years, where the courts have said this Te Tiriti at its heart has an idea of partnership between these two jurisdictions or spheres of authority, and that there should be shared authority about things. Again, we can debate later whether that's actually still an encroachment on Māori rangatiratanga. And of course the Crown hasn't upheld, they have their own assumption about their own parliamentary supremacy and superiority. But so shared authority then is the idea that those who have kind of rights and interests and around a particular, whether it's a piece of land or a waterway, should be involved in those decisions, that we have more robust decisions, that the process, when the process is fair and inclusive in that way, rather than excluding others. And of course, we've got lots of examples where Māori, even after an injustice and have had land returned, continue to be generous in sharing.
Well, tell us about your puna.
Oh yeah, well, it's a bit fraught at the moment. But I was going to talk about in Auckland, there's some lands around Takaparafo, which was called Bastion Point, where there was a massive protest, and where the Hikoi just visited yesterday, and they eventually had some land returned to them, and then they created gardens, food gardens, and shared the veggies with everyone, and people can, the public can still cycle through there. At Ōkahu Bay, that was returned to Ngāti Whātua Ōrākei, but all Aucklanders can still access it, so they still share it. So that we have lots of occasions of that. The Wanganui River, which is now has its own legal personhood, Te Awa Tupua, the iwi there are part of a governance group, but they've also included in, you know, Fish and Game and other, you know, NGO groups, as well as local government and central government agencies. So it's a kind of even beyond, much more inclusive. Yeah. So contrary to, I think, some of the unfounded fears around, oh, well, Māori will treat us how we've treated them and lock us out
and close it all.
Actually, the evidence suggests the opposite. There continues to be this generosity because, again, I think many Māori communities still see the value in including other folks who are here as part of our kind of aspirations and community. You know, there are all sorts of benefits from that. If we digress from that question.
Not too much. Well, so that kind of leads us on to the next thing I wanted to talk about, which was in the Me Tua Uru report, which I think we put a link in the invite to this session. You can click on it and have a look through it. I really love the way that you use these already existing projects and case studies to develop your framework from what might work in Aotearoa. And I sort of feel like you were kind of calming the farm. Like, look, here's a lot of examples where it hasn't been a disaster and it's been, as you said, it's opened up access for all kinds of people. So could you tell us a bit more about how you collected the case studies and continue to do so? Because I noticed on your Me Tua Uru site, you keep uploading, or LinkedIn, you keep sharing more case studies. And what that approach to developing the action plan enables. And did you get any pushback on their way of doing it?
Yeah, so usually the kind of common way we would be researching based in, particularly in a Māori studies sort of discipline, if you like, would be, you know, in having long-standing relationships with a particular community, already have existing connections, meet with them, you know, formulate the research project together, and, you know, go that way. For this project, we started doing that, and we all, Carwyn Jones and Ellie Tapsell and I all have connections with our own hapu and iwi, and tried to get people to, you know, let's have a look at our example, you know, does anyone want to do this? One of the things we found is just people are stretched and really busy, and so we thought, well, you know, in some ways we're reporting on some of these things. It's not a research, it is a research project, but at the same time it's showcasing some of these. So we started getting some examples, and then we were in touch with those groups and said, we're thinking of doing this. We think you're doing amazing work, and it will inspire others. You know, are you okay about us writing about you? Which is not usually the way, you know, in Māori circles you do it. You tend, you know, nothing, you know, about us without us kind of thing. But most of those groups were happy. Or we didn't put it, you know, all the groups that are in our report were happy. We contacted and said, are you okay about us talking about this? Do you want to, here's what we've written about you. Does that sound okay to you? And most of the time we'd taken it from things that they'd already said publicly, which again fitted back into something that we'd been telling Crown agencies to do for a long time, is, you know, instead of going out and, you know, wasting people's time interviewing them again about, you know,
read the iwi management plan.
What are your thoughts on fresh water for the 20th time? Actually read the submissions and the statements that they put out publicly about it. So we followed our own advice as well and said, okay, well, we'll look at their environmental management, look at their annual reports, and collected the information that way. But we did check it with them, and all of them were happy. Some amendments were made, and updates and things like that. So I don't know if that's, you know, all the ways the way to do it. It's worked for this in this particular context. I think our tendency would still be to have you know, particular communities that we know we're doing something tangible for as part of kind of reciprocating. But
I've noticed you've just recently advertised asking for people to, if any community, this is off script, but I just saw the other day that you on Me Too ā-uru inviting communities to
Yes.
partner with you for the next steps.
Yeah. So the National Science Challenges have all come to an end technically, but with sort of the last remaining funding that we had, we thought we've done a whole lot of research, and again we've done our action plan with the change in government. Now a whole lot of things that were really getting movement and traction prior to the election have either been halted or rolled back or defunded. Jobs for Nature's gone. So we thought, well, there's no point us continuing, researching in that particular way. We thought, actually, we've got the stuff here. A train the trainers sort of scenario seemed to be more suitable for the current context that we're in. And bringing together, so the National Science Challenges are divided up, climate change, which was in the weirdly named Deep South Challenge, from us looking at biodiversity and biosecurity. Buildings and towns. And so there've been these sort of segregations in some ways. And we've worked out that there was fantastic crossover in the things that you were doing. So in some ways it's to bring in the climate adaptation and have a series, again, also keeping in mind the degrowth things and confronting the reality that we've had. We're in climate change. It's upon us. It's these extreme weather events. This is it. It's only this is it. So thinking about a wānanga series which talks through water storage, how to test your waterways, energy, renewable energy. Which ones are suitable in particular places. How does that fit in terms of then end of life for those products as well, and food security and thinking about food resilience and so on. So these sorts of topics, repair and recycle. Congratulations on your funding. Those sorts of bringing those together, thinking about the places that we go. So our first one will be here at the university, but within our living building, which does have renewable energy. It's got solar, and we'll only be able to use the solar that we generate. And the water, collect our water and recycle the grey water, and so on. So there's some things there, but then go to other communities and ensure that, if it's native seed banking that they want to do, that we do that workshop there, and that's fulfills something for them, and all the while training a cohort who will promise us that they'll go out and train others.
Oh, that's cool. And is this material that you guys have produced related to your capability kind of building?
Yeah, well, at the heart of what we kept getting to, and it sounds sort of naff, and might not sound naff to folks here, but the relationships, having trusting and respectful relationships, are the things that underpin governance models. In political science, we're often serious politics, sort of over here. But actually, that if you can't have a cup of tea and have respectful relationships, doesn't mean you're always singing Kumbaya. You can disagree, but that having those relationships are the foundation point for your kin and kin-like relationships, and then for ability to make decisions. And again, reflecting on climate change being upon us, we do have these tough decisions. Well, should we move, and where are we going to move to? Do we need to consume less? Yes. Which things are we going to consume less of? Which, if we need some renewable energy to electrify something, what are the things that we're carefully going to be using that electricity for? So that's what the wānanga series is about.
That's great. We've got one more, and then we'll open it up to some questions. So the last one is the really keen to think about the overlap between the ideas of ethical coordinates from Gibson Graham's work and your early work on Māori ethical coordinates and the use of orienting po in the report. And I know in, like our university has a set of PO, we have the learning outcome PO. So PO's used a lot in strategic planning in Aotearoa. But what extent do you think that idea overlaps with ethical coordinates? How do those things, and that can be a short answer, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, they still overlap. It's just, I think, kind of commons, consumption, necessity, there's in surplus, there's still things in there, and it'd be great to see other Māori scholars kind of still use the coordinates, I think, to tease out the detail of some of the Māori land trusts or iwi things that are happening, because I think the way of looking at that will still flush these things out, but it doesn't quite fit in the Māori world.
Not the specific coordinates, I mean more the idea of using coordinates. Yeah.
Well, the PO thing is always usually a whare metaphor.
Yeah,
a whare requires different PO to hold up the house.
Yeah.
And people often talk about colonisation, wrecking the PO of the whare and destroying the kind of Māori way of being or worldview. And so that's sort of the idea there. But as I said before, I think they do, even though we think of them as kind of values, they do give or have implied suggestions about the correct sorts of behaviours and practices that are anticipated. And so are that kind of wayfinding guide as well.
Yeah. Oh, that's really cool. Final question. You seem to, I don't know if you are today, but you seem to maintain a lot of hope in the face of difficulty. And tell us a bit about what sustains you in your work and how you manage that against the other things that might be bringing you down.
Well, actually, last night the yoga teacher was saying, "No mud, no lotus." I was thinking,
okay,
the lotus grows in the mud pond, So sometimes there's a bit of muck that you got to wait through before the beauty. But I think seeing, what else can you do? You've got to keep going on, and I think I've seen other rangatira in our iwi, so Hirani Moko Mead, who, I observed during the negotiations with the Crown, and he was just always kind of pacing himself along, and no matter what bad news would come, he would sit there and think about it and then say, oh, well, we'll try this now then, and then that got thwarted by the Crown. He'd say, oh, well, we'll try this now, and so just got to keep on keeping on. I think, what else is there except to try and make the world a better place and, to bring into being these other possible ways of living that we know are already emergent.
Yeah. Oh, wow. Thank you for that. And we just wanted to leave some time for some discussion and some questions for Maria and myself, or just thoughts you've been having at the moment in our contemporary struggles. So we'll just open it up. Are you all right to keep an eye on the chat for us, Molly, too? Because I don't know where that pops up.
Yes.
Oh, here it is.
I'll keep an eye on the chat for you.
Thank you.
Oh. Yeah, hi. Really great to hear this discussion. And thanks, Maria, for this this work. It's been really great over the years to kind of connect together but we haven't had many chances to think together. I mean, we've kind of interacted over writing and stuff like that. So it's really nice to have this space. And it just occurred to me thinking about when you're mentioning PO as values in a way, where values fit into community economy thinking, because to some extent, when I think about the way we kind of conceptualize those coordinates or ethical coordinates or concerns or whatever, they're all really about negotiations, I think. We kind of pose them as these spheres of where negotiation has to occur. And to some extent, they're kind of also in a language that then sits between maybe a different vision of a future, which possibly has values attached to it, and kind of the economics mainstream, which is, you know, so imposing us with a growth-oriented, you know, competition, individualized, and all that sort of stuff. So, you know, some of the terms obviously are coming from various traditions of economics: consumption, surplus, you know, exchange, commons less so, but, you know, still a strand, and investment and so on. So I'm just thinking how, you know, when you say things are cobbled together, I'm just wondering where negotiation fits in the values, like, because they seem to be and agreed upon principles and values to some extent that hold the community together. So how does negotiation within authority and balance and guardianship and genealogy actually take place? And could we try and tease that out a bit more, using perhaps, you know, activating those ethical concerns that we identified, and is that appropriate? I'm not sure whether they do fit together or not. But anyway, it just occurred to me that in a way we don't really talk about a set of values in community economies, and yet I think we all share some. But I think it's such an, I guess the idea of community is one where there's been never an attempt to set up a sort of set of principles that are our set of values, which I think happens within other economic alternatives, maybe within the solidarity economy, for instance, or others. And I'm kind of interested in why we haven't done that. But anyway, I just wondered about any reflections you might have on that notion of negotiation.
Yeah, I think one of the things is that, there's a kind of crossover with what we talk about as these Māori legal traditions, or Māori law, which is also called tikanga Māori, just to confuse everyone. And so within there, that looks different in sort of every different part of the country. So down in Matt's area, the sort of tikanga that they have is shaped by their particular context in Te Waipounamu, by their particular histories, and so they do it sort of slightly differently. And that, so again, that's a sort of reminder of but the different Māori nations all have slightly different tikanga. I guess, is the sort of beginning of that explanation. So it's understood that, when you go to somebody else's area, and we've been having these large unity meetings, I guess you would call them, Huia Motu this year, given in response to the government's attack on nature and attack on Māori. So there was one in the Waikato in the central North Island, one on the east coast, or one up in Waitangi, and then one just recently down in Matt's rohe. And so that was sort of shaped quite differently. And when you go somewhere else, that they'll do their welcome ceremony slightly differently, but because you're in their area, you abide by the way they do it. Here in Wellington, they've got particular practices. You go around and hongi first, you touch noses, which is just a kind of to illustrate the dynamic of that negotiation. It's understood in the Māori world that different groups do things differently, and it's sort of like when in Rome, So when in Ngāi Tahu, you do it the way they tell you to do it. So that already gives you, some acknowledgement of difference, but still commonalities as well. And then within that, tikanga is also understood to change based on circumstance. So there are some other more fundamental principles which are called kaua, which are more foundational, but tikanga can change. So if you go, so again, just sort of to illustrate, if you go to a welcome ceremony and you don't have a woman to do the karanga, the call, which you're meant to have as the first voice on the marae, then you stay silent. But that's accepted that it shifts then. So usually you're meant to have someone to call for you to welcome you on or to reply. But if you don't have that, then the tikanga shifts for that occasion. And we've actually had lots of, in the kind of context of, well, the broader term here is takatapui, and I've forgotten the acronym. There's a Pacifica acronym for trans LGBTQ plus. I've forgotten the Pacifica one. It's a long one, but you know, those sorts of dynamics around, you know, our whānau members who, you know, there might be different tikanga that needs to shift for. So, you know, those things are then kind of negotiated as well. So there is a hierarchy in the way those things would be negotiated in terms of who gets a say. So usually it'll be, you know, the people who are from there, who have connection to that particular place, and within that group, there'll be, again, tends to usually be consensus decision making, but that can be rushed by all sorts of circumstances. So people get to have their say, and that's again where, when they're having their say, those what we call those values will surface about, well, these people are our, you know, our relations from, you know, the next door marae, or, you know, down the road, or, you know, we have a relationship with them through someone's cousin, or in our area, the question is usually because we have waterways that are tributaries that flow into the Waikato. So that would be our conversation. The Waikato is that our rivers, you know, our streams flow into your river, and therefore we're connected in a sort of ecosystem. So that, yeah, depending what the topic is, those would be the things that would kind of come to the surface and then be weighed up in that negotiation. And yeah.
My observation, just coming off of Noho Marae, is there's such a wealth of tikanga around disagreeing and bringing things to light and having conversations. Like, as a Pākehā, there's quite, for me, feels uncomfortable, but there does seem to be a lot of there's a structure for holding together disagreement in those traditional processes that, yeah, seems really helpful.
Yeah, and I guess one of the, in terms of that, is that kind of, again, Hirine's Mokome's take utu ea, you know, and thinking about coming back to that principle of all gifts need to be reciprocated. So good gifts and bad gifts need to be reciprocated, and it's the weighing up the appropriate response to something. And again, that would weigh, you know, has the person who's, you know, done something wrong, are they someone's, you know, are they young, you know, did they intend to do it, what happened, are they remorseful, or, you know, those things then get weighed up in terms of the type of response or sanction that's placed on person or groups or whatever. Of course, that's disrupted with colonisation. We'd probably like to sanction the Crown a little bit more and give a bit more of a fulsome response to them, but we're not really able to in the power dynamic at the moment.
I see Catherine's got a question, but one more thing I would say is maybe what Kathy and Julie have done is they've framed the ethical coordinates as questions. Like, how do we distribute surplus? But I feel like what you're calling values are also questions. How do we relate to one another ethically? Or how do we exchange reciprocally? How do we... So it's almost like in the language, you guys have chosen to use it as open-ended questions, and you've chosen to name it by the value, but in many ways they're not, you have to do it this way. They're a question. They're a question.
Yeah, it's still a question.
Yeah. Catherine.
Yeah, thanks. Kia ora, Maria. So nice to hear you talking, and so nice to hear about the work you've been doing. I'm really looking forward to coming over to Te Herenga Waka in the new year. And
She's your new professor.
I'm joining. I'm coming. I'm moving back. So can't wait to be in the same place as you and have the chance for some more conversations.
Excellent news on this grim day.
So I've slightly lost track of what I was thinking about, but it was around the kind of coordinates as questions and as wayfinding points. And yeah, I agree. I feel that even though community hasn't articulated values as such, there's values embedded in those questions. And of course, there's values that are embedded in the language as well that's come from all those different traditions that Kath has recognised. And I feel for me over the last couple of years of particularly working with the Surviving Well Together idea and language, what's come to the surface for me is what's missing from those coordinates, and what's missing is often spirit. And it's really clear, just to give one example, you know, I've been working with communities in East Timor recently, and one of the really big things that they do with their resources, with their money, with their time is to contribute to the Umalisan community, the kin reciprocity ceremony contributions that happen, and everyone's really worried about that. People are worried about it because they're too big, it's too much, it's kind of considered somehow wasteful. And I feel like certainly the obligations are onerous for poor families, but at the same time, there's, in that language that we inherit from an economic tradition, there's not space to say, actually, there's really important, crucial value in this mode of exchange. And it does more than what we look for if we're looking for the kind of exchange, surplus, investment that language orients us to. And I just wonder if you've got any reflections about that, about that space for spirit in these discussions about how we make decisions about and manage. I want to say something other than resources at this point, and it's too early in the morning. I'm not getting the language. Yeah.
Yeah, well,
I'll leave it there. Have you got any reflections on that question of spirit?
One thing I was thinking is, yeah, by other standards, you know, a lot of times, so in the Crown devised treaty settlements process that we have, you know, one of the big things that Māori always want is land back, that the land taken, they want back. And if not specifically that, but then, you know, something else in their rohe, in their area, and which is, you know, kind of all about spirit, you know. Often that land is, by other measures, not valuable, you know. And you know, an apartment building in downtown Auckland would be much, you know, much better, you know, request if you were asking for something, or whatever it might be. And so there's these bits of land that Māori seek to have back, or in our case, on the west side of our mountain, there's land held by the Department of Conservation, which is others call dock land, we call, you know, our land held by dock, which we want back as well, but it's just native, you know, well, but it's native bush, but you know, such a treasure to us. And again, most of that is about spirit in many ways, in the sense of the stories that are embedded in that land, the special places that we know our tupuna had, the particular trees that were named on some old maps as, you know, great for catching birds, or, you know, doing those sorts of things. So, you know, it's that, and there's other research which talks, you know, is talking about now, here in the School of Government, Arthur Grimes and Rowan Tom are doing that research about, you know, connection to place and culture, really, you know, again, and language supporting well-being of Māori people, and that that disconnection then having an impact, you know, negative impact on Māori communities when that's taken away. So that kind of connection with land, I think, is probably, for me, yeah, you know, best example. So I've heard people say, well, why do Māori, you know, why would you, and then save up all your money and try and buy back another scrappy bit of land, or you know, again,
and then not develop it,
you know, just plant native trees on it and try and, you know, bring back the birds in the bush. You know, which is no dividends, that, you know, it's a thankless task. And, you know, and I guess that's sort of, you know, in our context now with climate change, we've had that, you know, the 1989 kind of cutoff point for in our emissions trading scheme. And so there are a whole lot of people now that are re-wetting wetlands that were drained before and regenerating places, and they're all getting either, you know, high praise and or money, whereas those Māori communities that have, you know, held on to those get nothing, not even the thank yous. So, but that, I think, is about the spirit in those places and the value of having a place to go, and that giving purpose and meaning to communities, and keeping alive those stories for children and mokopuna and the communities, giving a kind of worth and value to being there, to upholding those obligations to that place, to trying to regenerate, you know, semi-destroyed or polluted areas and waterways, and
Can I jump in on that? Just unless somebody else wants to ask a different question. But it seems to me, Catherine, that spirit, I think, is partly what is building the community. Like the idea of those practices that you're talking about, where people are worried about the expenditure on, you know, the house or on that tradition and so on, is a sort of an undermining that's happened with colonialism to then undermine the actual cultural fabric of that community, which is those practices that happened every year. Those rituals were and are part of what it is to enact community and to actually build up that trust that we've been talking about, that needs to be there in order to be able to, you know, practice those values or practice those negotiations. So, and I think similarly, that idea that, you know, buying the scrappy bit of land back again is about, again, re-establishing that kin relationship and, you know, making the community real, really. So in a way, it's kind of our under specification of what it is to make community that probably you're pointing to here, and the way in which we need a whole other vocabulary, whether it is spirit and trust. And I mean, even it's come up in this conference, the sort of value of the face-to-face and how important that is to continue the life-giving nature of a community. And, you know, we're trying to do this internationally, but, you know, so much, you know, we get so much more kind of impetus somehow by the face-to-face, and how important that is, and that's a real challenge for us as a community to kind of how we integrate that in our practice going forward. But it does seem like it's a really important thing, which is sort of buried in the term of becoming community in a way in our language, and yet it needs to be fleshed out a lot more, I think, and especially now, because, you know, we're seeing how so much of the trust in all sorts of communities is being undermined and devalued, and yet it is connected into these kind of very material issues, but it's really more connected into relationships, as Maria was saying. So it just, I mean, I think we need to flesh it out more, whether it's a coordinate or whether it's some sort of result somehow, or I don't know, it's some sort of it's just central to that idea of an ability to even negotiate with each other, which is going to need to have that kind of set of trust and respect and so on. Anyway, just some thinking of it. It's a really valuable kind of place for us to think more, I think.
I think that's where we're lucky. Well, I hate to do these comparisons, but anyway, within our context, I think we can usefully use Te Tiriti or Waitangi, that idea that there's sort of different, you know, that we can have a partnership, and that idea of shared authority, whether we want to use that term exactly, but that there's you know, non-Māori still have can still have a spiritual and, you know, close and intimate relationship and connection with the land as well. It's different from what we might have, but we can both have those side by side, and that sort of caring for place and waterways and so on can still sit together. And we've got a kind of mechanism by which we've got a sense of how we sit side by side, that I think is then it can include everybody.
But I think, I don't know if you've read Soren Larson and Jay Johnson's book, Being Together in Place. This is in the Canadian context, and they don't have te tiriti, but they say the same thing. The care for the place and the care for the land is what brings, you know, settlers and Indigenous peoples together to common, or to, to think about what that might be. So we're almost to the end, but Catherine, do you want to say
I was just going to jump in. I think it's the same. It's the same here, that there's, but it's harder to say that, and harder for people to feel trust in that everyone can have that connection. Everyone can care for country. Everyone carries obligations to country, and can enact those obligations. But that, although that's what, a lot of people are saying, it's not the dominant story that we hear about, and it's not a story that most settler Australians know about even. So that then when you get moments where the issues come to the fore, like at the moment, there's a place, Durite, Arapalis, where I go rock climbing with my family, and there's the traditional custodians have been working with the Parks Authority to think about how they manage access, how they set aside space in that place for spirit, for ceremony, places where rock climbers are not allowed to go, which is not quite land back, but it's some steps in that direction. And gosh, the climbing community is so upset about it. And they're upset because, you know, there's the story of there's lots of stories coming out of people's really strong connections to that place, and their love for it, and the way that that place has cared for them and healed them, and the work they've done in taking care of it. And you know, it's like, yes, that's all there, but it doesn't have to be in opposition. But there's no space to hold that conversation. Whereas te tiriti, it seems, it's so nice to hear you say that. I think it's something that Australia is so misses having.
Which comes back to the education system, and what some of the other research we've just had conducted recently, again by Jess Berenston Shaw and others, is that the even in Aotearoa, the level of understanding about what te tiriti is still sort of abysmally low. We've got some sort of New Zealand history, finally, what a shock, coming into our own school curriculum. But that'll take a while. So our students here are really keen and thirsty for that knowledge, but most New Zealanders still only have a vague idea of what you're even talking about. So it's always a bit of a work in progress, I think. But unfortunately, right now, given the disinformation networks and other things that we're up against, which are bubbling and kind of coming from the far right in the US and other places, you know, it's a very difficult challenge. But no mud, no lotus. So
I'm aware that sometimes the Zooms are backed up, and people might be waiting to use this particular Zoom meeting because I think we're only registered till 10. So it'd probably be good that we draw things together. But I thought a nice way to finish might be if you share with us the karakia that you started with and tell us what it means, and then we can do our best to say it together.
Okay. All right. So the karakia was Toitu, which is sort of one of the slogans at the moment with the movement for unity at the moment, which means to sort of hold tight to, or you know, hold fast with. And te whenua is the land, and then Toitu, so hold fast to the te tiriti, the treaty, and then me tū ā-uru is what we called our action plan, and that's about standing together like a group of kahikatea trees, which when they're on the side of a riverbank, they put their roots, they intertwine their roots to hold the riverbank strong. So which is also a kind of Māori metaphor for unity. If we stand together and keep our roots together and share the sustenance and, you know, across our root system, then we'll remain strong. There's lots of proverbs actually in Māori, the Māori world, about that idea of sticking together. You know, when you're on your own, you can, you know, be a reed that breaks in the wind, but standing together is where the strength is in that unity. So
and then it finishes with Haumie
Huie Taiki, which is kind of bind together, strengthen, and sort of affirmation.
Yeah.
You want to do that one?
Let's do it.
Yeah, okay.
Okay.
Kia koutou. Toi tu te whenua, toi tu te tiriti, me tua ā-uru, haumie huie taiki. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
That
That was wonderful.
I saw you there coming in from the US.
Thanks very much.
Thanks so
Maria.
much.
Bye.
Bye.
Everyone.
Thanks, ka kite.